Welcome on board. Welcome to my podcast. Today, I'm very thrilled to have my former colleague, the deputy editor of The Economist, Tom Standage, also the editor of The World Ahead 2026. This is your third or fourth roll out the Economist forecast of the future. But I think at the end of the year, we are always thrilled to hear your forecast of the future. Can you share with us the top 10 of your picks?
Sure. So I think obviously there's a lot of uncertainty in the world
Yeah.
right now, and the biggest thing is still going to be the uncertainty coming out of the White House and the way that that makes things very unpredictable for people all over the world. Um, but I think the ten themes. I start with something that we know is going to happen. We always like anniversaries at the World Ahead because we know that nothing can stop them. There
Yeah.
is going to be the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence in America, so a kind of birthday party for America. But it's going to be a very weird birthday party because the Republicans on the one hand and the Democrats on the other are going to be telling very different stories about America's past, present, and future. And there's also going to be this rather strange situation that the celebrations of the birthday have been organized by a committee that was set up many years ago. But Donald Trump doesn't like the look of this committee, so he's set
Mm.
up another one, and he wants different kinds of events. In particular, he's going to have a cage fighting match, so mixed martial arts. On the lawn of the White House as part of the
Yeah.
celebration. So it's
Yeah.
which is a sort of, unintentional metaphor for the nature of American politics, which sometimes does look like a cage fight.
Yeah.
But anyway, they're going to have this big party, and they're going to, celebrate different aspects of the past and the present of
So, so,
America.
so it will be like a competing narratives and also a bit
Exactly.
of a profiteering from
I'm
Trump
sure there'll
itself
be
himself.
who can say
Yeah.
what there's going to be. I mean, Trump is always about the business, right? That's the
Yeah.
way he does everything. So that's just the way he is. Anyway, the funny thing is that it's not just a party because the voters then get to vote in the midterm elections in November. So they get to actually say which vision of where America is going they like the look of more. And that's going
Mm.
to be a real litmus test, I think, for the two parties are going. Basically, how do the Democrats think is the best way to fight Donald Trump? Which themes are going to work? Are they going to coalesce around a particular leader? We'll find out. And then there's also the possibility that Donald Trump might try to intervene in the results of the midterm elections if he thinks the Republicans are doing badly. And there's sort of concern that he's already making plans to do that. So it will also be a test of how far he's prepared to go in the direction of authoritarianism. So that's the
Mm.
number one. Number two
Yeah.
is on geopolitics and sort of how should you look at the world if you were on the moon. And we quite often think about this as The Economist. Basically the view from the moon. If you were an alien looking down at the Earth, how would you describe the current geopolitical situation? So
Yeah.
during Joe Biden's administration, he had a very simple framing. He said that basically the world was in a new Cold War, and that there were two blocks, one led by China, one led by America, and that kind of everyone else had to pick a side. And whether or not you agree with that framing, that was how the American government saw it. And so it made it possible to understand how American foreign policy worked and how America saw the world. And Donald Trump doesn't seem to be thinking that way. We're not quite sure what he thinks instead, but one theory is that he wants to divide the world up, and he wants to allow America to do whatever it likes in what he calls our hemisphere, so the
Mm.
Americas, and
Yeah.
then Russia would be able to do whatever it likes in Europe, and China would be able to do whatever it likes in Asia, and Saudi Arabia would be able to do whatever it likes in the Middle East, and they would all agree to not fight each other and not criticize each other, and they could all just get on with their own stuff in their own backyard.
Mm.
And Donald Trump seems to be sort of leaning in that direction that America is not going to be the world's policeman. It's not going to tell other countries how they should run things, although he does want to tell Europe actually how it should run things. He doesn't like the way Western Europe is going. But anyway, we don't know. And the national security strategy that's just been put out by the
Yeah.
Pentagon does seem to point in this direction, but it's a bit unclear because really what they're trying to do is they're trying to put an intellectual framework around Donald Trump's geopolitical thinking. And there isn't really a coherent theory underneath it all. Donald Trump likes to do things by instinct, and
Mm.
that's and be very transactional and go with his gut. He doesn't like grand geopolitical theories.
mm,
And there's a very useful expression that helps that makes it easier to understand this, I think, which is, and this is what they say in Washington. They say that Donald Trump's thinking is a mystery, not a secret. So there isn't, right. So there
mm,
isn't a secret plan that we just
yes,
haven't been told. It's
mm,
just whatever Donald Trump feels like doing at the time, and that
yeah,
changes all the time.
yeah, yeah,
So the difficulty is, so there isn't a new theory, and we would like there to be a new theory because journalists like
mm,
theories and business people
mm,
like theories. They can plan, and foreign policy people like theories because they can plan. But we can't plan. Instead, all we're going to see is the existing rules-based system, all of the kind of institutions and treaties and everything that we had in place. All of that is going to continue to crumble
mm,
and drift and decay. And it's all just going to be about deals between America and based on whatever Donald Trump feels like at the time. So this makes it very difficult for other countries to plan. And we have a guest article by the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, and he says that one of the responses to this unpredictability is that other countries, groups of countries, are getting together just sort of in an informal, ad hoc way to deal with specific problems because the existing ways of trying to deal with big problems like the
mm,
World Trade Organization and the UN, all of that's kind of frozen or broken down now. So in things like, how to help Ukraine, there is this informal group called the Coalition of the Willing. In things like,
mm,
how should the West reduce its dependence on rare earth elements from China? There's a bunch of countries working on that. How can different countries that aren't trading with America, how can they improve their trade links with each other to compensate for its tariffs? There's a bunch of
mm,
efforts to do that. So I think we're going to see more of this kind of, making it up as you go along kind of approach
mm.
in geopolitics, at least for the next few years. So
But
that's,
do you think, yeah, do you think there'll be ways to influence Trump and
yeah, well, it's very
influence
obvious what the
him?
way
Yeah,
to influence him is. You
yeah,
have to be a member of his club. You have to
yeah.
go to the Oval Office with a gold bar or
Kiss the ring. Yeah,
some other present. Exactly.
yeah,
And so the problem is that, I mean, Trump loves this because the unpredictability and the sort of, everything depends on how he feels in the moment gives
yeah,
him a lot of power. It means that everyone, world leaders, CEOs, they have to go to the Oval Office and they have to be nice to him and they have to give him presents. And then maybe give them a deal and exempt them from tariffs or whatever. He did this with Apple. They gave him a gold bar and he said, okay, you don't have to pay tariffs on the iPhone.
yeah,
So the problem is that most people can't do this. Most people are not world leaders and CEOs. If you run a small company, you
yeah,
cannot get on Donald Trump's radar. You cannot get a
mm,
special deal.
yeah. You're at the
And
mercy of his whims. Yeah.
exactly. And so you have this complete nightmare of unpredictability. So that's the difficult thing about it. But that's also why Trump likes it the way it is, because everything depends on him and being nice to him.
Mm,
Anyway, on to number three, which is kind
yeah.
of the situation with conflict around the world. Are we going to have more war or more peace? And the answer is yes, because we're kind of having both of them. And this is because it's becoming increasingly difficult to tell the difference between the two. So we are seeing in Northern Europe, we are seeing these strange things like drones appearing over airports and
Yeah.
cables being cut and mysterious fires in warehouses and cyber attacks. And it's probably Russia doing all of these things, but it's hard to tell. And so what we are seeing is instead of the kind of old model of conflict where one country invades another, and
Mm,
obviously there are conflicts like that, and it's good that the fighting has stopped in Gaza. I think the fighting is going to continue in Ukraine and in Myanmar and in Sudan. But what's interesting is that more and more conflicts now look like these sort of weird, sort of jostling for
mm,
influence, but in a deniable way. And this is happening not in a particular country, but it's happening in the spaces between countries, on the high seas, on the seabed, in orbit, in cyberspace.
yeah.
In the Arctic, which is melting, and that means there's more,
Mm,
rivalry happening there. So the nature of conflict is changing, and the line between war and peace is becoming a lot more blurry, and so that's why we're seeing tension rising in all of these
yeah.
unconventional grey conflicts.
But
Um,
it's harder to contain if conflicts become multidimensional rather than
it is, and also,
straightforward.
if you can't tell, I mean, we've had this problem with hybrid warfare with
Yeah.
with Russia, it's very hard to, it's all deniable. You can't prove what's happening
Yeah.
a lot of the time, but you just have to, and it's very, very difficult uh, to to fight back against it. If drones start showing up around airports, it's very, very difficult to police your airspace against drones, and it's very difficult to police your information systems against misinformation and so on. So it's that's the nature of conflict in this new
Yeah.
world. So then I move on to talking about so 4 and 5 in my list of top tens. 4 is about Europe and 5 is about China, and they're
Yeah.
kind of two sides of the same coin because this situation that we're now in is particularly difficult for Europe, but it presents particular opportunities for China. So if we start with Europe, basically Europe has a whole load of problems right now. Its growth is too low. It has to increase spending on defense. It has to keep Donald Trump on side and not, make him angry because it doesn't want like tariffs and it doesn't want him to pull American forces out of Europe. It also wants to remain an advocate for free trade and for environmental standards.
Yeah.
And it has huge budget deficits. So it's got like loads and loads of problems, and it's really hard to see how it can solve, any of them, frankly, I mean, let alone solving all of them at once. And one of the things it's trying to do sometimes, as you will know, you can solve two problems by crashing them into each other. And
Yeah.
there's two particular problems Europe is trying to solve by crashing them into each other, which are the fact that it's not spending enough on defence and the fact that its growth is too slow. So the idea is that by spending more on defence and spending it within Europe, it can create jobs and boost growth. And it will probably work a little bit. But the idea that this is going to revive the European economy is, frankly, implausible. The other thing that Europe is starting to do is recognizing that actually it has imposed too much regulation on its companies. It's making life harder for them. It's making it harder for them to compete globally. So we are going to see some watering down of some regulations or the delaying of some regulations in areas like data privacy, some of the new environmental rules it wants to impose on imports and also on AI. So,
Yeah.
but again, that might make a little bit of a difference, but it probably won't make enough of a difference to really boost growth. Meanwhile, on the other side of the coin, China has a huge opportunity, and it's absolutely taking it to improve its global influence right now because America has been withdrawing from the world, but America has also been damaging its own reputation. So things like
Mm.
cutting all of its foreign aid to Africa means that China is showing up in Africa and saying, well, you can trust us, we're a more reliable partner, let's invest in your infrastructure, help you build some clean tech power systems, that kind of thing. And so
Mm.
China has done a string of deals across the global south. And then at the same time, of course, Donald Trump has alienated his own allies by imposing tariffs on everyone. He's attacked universities, he's attacked scientific researchers. This means that fewer students want to go to America, and it means that researchers, scientists, some of them want to leave America if they're there now. If you're a
Yeah.
researcher in another part of the world, in the past you dreamed of going to America, where the scientists were the best in the world, and we see that and we see this particularly from China. You'll know about
Yeah.
the fraction of papers published in America that actually have Chinese co-authors. But those days are over, and I think if you're a scientist in another part of the world, you don't want to go to America anymore. And in particular, Chinese science and Chinese technology absolutely can hold its own against American science and technology. So this is just a massive own goal by America that is reducing its soft power. And another piece we have in the world ahead is actually about Chinese soft power and the fact
Yeah.
that things like Labubu dolls and BYD cars
Yeah.
and
The cool
TikTok,
factor.
right, exactly. These are Chinese products that people around the world want to use.
Yeah.
And so, there's very much a kind of a change in the wind, right? That when I was growing up in Europe, everyone in Europe thought America was the coolest country in the world and they wanted to go and live and work there. That is not true anymore.
Yeah.
And in fact, we have a piece about young people in Africa who are no, they feel that the West, that Europe and America have cut their aid to Africa, and they're saying, well, maybe we need to be looking east to the Gulf, to
Mm.
China, to Japan, to Malaysia, and these are the sorts of places that we should be going to study and aspiring to go and work rather than going to the
Yeah.
West. So it's a real shift.
It's a real shift. And can I ask a follow-up question on
Sure.
EU and China? Because of course, it seems
Yeah.
as if, on the scientist side, China and Europe are all trying to attract, to get disgruntled scientists to
Yeah.
both countries. But do you see any way of collaborating between the two? Because, Macron was in China last week. Of course, sending mixed signals. On the one hand, of
Yes.
course, we want to more collaboration, but on the other hand, with China exporting growth exceeding 1 trillion in terms of surplus, and not to the States, but to the rest of the
No, no,
world.
exactly.
The
No,
world
China has
is
done.
concerned about the dumping
Yeah, no,
and other
exactly. China
things.
has done a great job of. The US is still China's biggest export market,
Yeah,
but obviously the level of exports to the US has gone down with the tariffs, and China has done. I think just reported figures that show it has a record overall trade surplus. So
that's the, yeah.
it's done a very good job of finding other markets for its products. And in fact, there's an extraordinary chart. There's one of my favorite charts that is it shows the imports of solar panels to sub-Saharan African countries, 20 different countries, and they've all absolutely shot up, which is great news
Yeah.
for people in those countries because they have cheap and reliable access to electricity. It's great news for the climate. But if you're a company, and there are some companies in Nigeria, for example, that make solar panels, you cannot compete with solar panels coming from China. They are just
Yeah.
cheaper and better. And so, what do you do about that? And similarly, if you're trying to, run a car maker in Europe or in North Africa or anywhere really, you can't compete with Chinese EVs. So I think there is you know on both sides the question of whether the EU and China could do some kind of deeper deal and open up new areas of trade and collaboration, particularly because the EU and China believe in when you do a deal, you stick to the deal. You don't just
Yeah.
change your mind next week because the president's, had a bad day. So there is a sort of let's be the adults in the room element to this. But you're absolutely right. I think the main concern that European leaders have is the extent of the risk to their own industries from Chinese clean tech exports in particular. The solar panels, the batteries, the cars, and they're particularly worried about the European car industry. I'm not sure the European car industry can be saved. I think some bits of it will survive, but it looks very much to me like what happened to Nokia and
Mm.
Ericsson and
Yeah.
those companies
Yeah.
and Motorola when the smartphone came along. Because the European car makers have spent 100 years getting very good at making gearboxes, and we don't need gearboxes anymore, and we don't need internal combustion engines, and it's really, really hard to switch to making what is in effect a completely different product with an
Mm.
electric car. And I've been really struck by, the Xiaomi cars in particular. I mean, that
Yeah.
just shows you that cars nowadays have more in common with phones than they do with old-fashioned,
Yeah, yeah. I think
combustion cars.
they are redefining the whole industry. But do you think
Exactly.
that with Volkswagen leading, do you think more companies, car companies in Europe would adopt if I couldn't fight them, join them
Yes,
strategy?
so I don't know I don't know how that would play out in practice. I think there is,
Yeah,
I mean, we have seen, Chinese companies setting up manufacturing plants elsewhere.
yeah,
Obviously the plans to do that in Mexico have had to be
yeah,
put on ice because Donald Trump doesn't like that. But I think, yes, we're starting to have, these discussions between Chinese companies and European countries where the European countries are saying, well, you can set up a country, but you basically need to teach us how to do this. We need to have
yeah,
technology transfer from
yeah,
China. And this is extraordinary because even, I can remember when, even just 20 years ago or 30 years
yeah,
ago, with things like high-speed rail and, telecoms networks, it was the Chinese companies that were
yeah.
insisting on
On the
the
transfer,
technology transfer.
technology
Right.
learning and
And
transfer. Yeah,
right, and it's completely flipped around now, and the Chinese companies are the best when it comes to the batteries and the EVs at this point. So yeah, that is a change. I think the other question that we look at is whether because so China would like to get into the CPTPP trade or do a deal with the
yeah,
CPTPP countries. And the irony there, of course, is that CPTPP was originally set up, led by America, to be a counterbalance to China in Asian trade and in Pacific trade. And then America left it because Donald Trump doesn't like free trade. And now China would like to join this club that was meant to be the kind of counterbalance to China. So
yeah,
it shows you how kind of the world is being turned upside down, and sort of
yeah.
old assumptions that were were true just a few years ago just aren't true anymore, and
Yeah,
how
yeah,
much
I
the
think
world
that's
has
a key
changed.
takeaway. Yeah, then
Yeah,
throw away the
exactly.
old assumption, adapt to the new reality. Yeah,
Exactly, exactly.
yeah,
Anyway, so that's the first five. And
yeah.
number six is about the economy and the kind of broader, is there going to be a financial crisis? We
Yeah.
wrote in The Economist recently that we are in a recession. In other words, recessions are happening less often than they used to, and we're kind of overdue some kind of financial crisis.
Mm,
And there are various plausible places it could come from. One of obviously is the trade war itself. So far, it has to be said, the US economy and the global economy have actually been very resilient in the face of all this uncertainty around the tariffs. So global growth actually looks like it's going to be about the same as it was last year.
mm,
Trade has continued to grow just more slowly than it might have done, possibly. But we are seeing signs of a slowdown in the US. So it's possible that you get sort of that kind of effect. But I think the other questions, the other sources of uncertainty are what happens in the bond markets, because developed countries, so the OECD and the G7 countries, are running these huge deficits for the most part. The average deficit across the G7 is, I think, 6%. So they are spending more than they're taking in taxes, and they're borrowing the difference. And this cannot go on forever.
yeah.
They increased their spending during COVID, and they haven't ratcheted it back down again. Um, so at some point, the bond markets are going to say that, they're not willing to borrow to lend except at much higher rates, and a potential, we already see this happening with France. We had a sort of mini crisis in Britain a couple of years ago around this. I think the big question though is what happens in America, because the chairman of the Federal Reserve, his term comes to an end in May. Donald Trump
Yeah.
has to appoint his successor in January or February. And if Donald Trump chooses a friend of his who will just do whatever he's told and cut rates, then the bond markets may be rather unhappy, because it will look as though he's trying to juice the economy before the midterms. Of course, if
Mm,
you do cut rates, yes, you would boost the economy, but you'd also boost inflation. And actually, American voters, the thing they dislike the most at the moment is the rising price of groceries and of
yeah, it's
the
an
cost of living.
affordability crisis
Exactly.
for the
Affordability is a
average.
big thing. So
Yeah.
actually cutting interest rates would be a terrible way of trying to deal with that, because it would just make inflation go up. But it would also, the suspicion might also be that America is planning to inflate away its debts, because it's just been
Mm,
borrowing more and more and more money. And Donald Trump's, he did a big tax cut in his first term. He's done another big tax cut now. None of it's being paid for. He says it's being paid for by tariffs. Tariffs are really just a very, very inefficient sales tax on American consumers. The amount of money they're bringing in is about a tenth of the amount of the income tax in the US. So the idea that you can replace income tax with tariffs is nonsense. So the sort of incoherent economic policy that Donald Trump has been pursuing, we've seen the uncertainty and the results that it's had on trade, but we might now start to see this having an impact on interest rates and on borrowing and on bond yields, and that could be much nastier, because that could cause a wider financial crisis. So
yeah,
yeah, the economy's been really resilient so far, and I think
yeah.
that's because countries have been able to adjust and companies have been able to adjust the way they trade, and also mostly countries have not retaliated against the tariffs. In
Yeah.
Europe, the EU just said, okay, 20% or whatever it is, we'll just roll over. Fair enough. They didn't want to pick a fight with America. China did, and China had the leverage because of the rare earths, and
Yeah.
China totally won that spat with, China completely outplayed America, I think, in the
Yeah.
trade war in 2025,
Yeah.
because at the end of the day, Chinese companies have this leverage with things like with rare earths, and America cannot do without them. And so
Mm,
America has been, has backed down on that. And, the concessions that China offered on things like soybeans are frankly meaningless. So it means that the potential for Donald Trump's policies to cause a really, really nasty financial accident
yeah.
that's growing. So that's one thing to keep an eye on. The next
Yeah.
point is number seven, is about AI, because there's also the risk. If you look at the US stock market, all of the growth in the last 2 years has come from AI stocks, and that's probably accounting for about half of US GDP growth now as well. It's coming from AI capex. And so if the bubble bursts, which I think it's quite likely to do, the revenue is just not there yet to sustain these
Mm,
valuations. if the bubble burst, that would make Americans feel poorer. The stock market, would go down. There would be a wealth effect, but it would also have global implications because in Asia, a lot of supply chains are feeding the American AI capex boom, and they're also feeding local AI capex booms. But I think the US stock market in particular looks really quite vulnerable to a correction on AI. And again, that could have wider consequences. You could have a sort of shallow but quite brief recession there. And I think that would bring some quite useful clarity. I think the AI scene could do with a shake-up.
Yeah, yeah.
But anyway, I think that's another source of risk to global markets and to the global economy.
How gloomy are you in terms of really popping the AI bubble popping? Because
Well,
I think
I'm
The
actually I'm
Economist, yeah, has
yeah
this new word of the year slop,
yeah.
meaning
No, exactly. Slop is another
yeah,
problem.
I know it's another.
But yeah, I mean, I'm actually quite optimistic. I'm very optimistic about AI as a transformative technology. I do think it's an important technology, and I think it will be used in all sorts of ways, and it will be baked into everything that we do, like the
Yeah,
internet has been. But I was, I began my career writing about the internet in the mid 90s before it really got going.
yeah,
And people made silly predictions about how quickly it would change things as well. It takes time, even if the technology could, even if AI could do everyone's jobs tomorrow, which it can't, by the way, but, even if it could, I think it would take most companies, 10 to 15 years to adopt it.
yeah,
And there is just so much inertia. And there are so many processes that need to be redesigned and rebuilt, and there needs to be a big kind of shakeout of old companies that don't change being replaced by new companies. We've seen this with the internet, right? But we've
mm,
seen this happen over a 30-year period, and it's all
yeah,
still going on. This
yeah,
fight that's going on in America now about whether Netflix gets to buy Warner Brothers or not. This is really a kind of, this is the internet shaking up media, and this
yeah,
is one of the new companies trying to buy one of the old ones, and it's got lots of films and movies and music and video games and that kind of stuff. But basically, they didn't, move with the times quickly enough, and now Netflix has come along and said this is the way you should be doing this kind of business.
mm,
So these
yeah,
things really take much longer than people think. So I think I think the artificial intelligence will be a
yeah,
transformative technology.
yeah,
But if you look at previous transformative technologies like the railways, like electricity, like the internet, there were booms and busts along the way before we got to mass adoption. And I think that's what we're going to see with AI. So I think,
yeah,
the companies we have now, it very much feels like Internet 1.0. The companies we have now dominating AI, I don't know whether they'll all still be there in, 5 years. It'll be another bunch of companies from who knows where. And I think Google in the long term is probably one of the winners, but I'm not so
yeah.
sure about some of the others.
Can I
So
ask a
we'll see.
follow-up question on AI?
Sure.
Because 2026 we'll see the first batch of graduates who are AI native, who joined the
Exactly.
university when ChatGPT was invented. They were
Yeah.
rolling out. But of course, the future looks a little bit bleak for them because entry-level jobs seems as if are not there for them. What is there a big concern, or should
Yes, I
we?
think so.
Yeah,
So that's my other prediction about
yeah,
AI is that whether there's a boom or a bust, I think there's going to be much more concern about the impact of AI on jobs and on graduate jobs in
yeah,
particular. And obviously, this has been a concern in China for some time that there's been quite high graduate unemployment. But it's concern about this is rising in America as well. And there was a paper published over the summer by Brynjolfsson et al. That sort of essentially said that companies are still hiring people at higher levels, but they're not hiring graduates as much as they were, and in
yeah,
fact, graduate employment is going down. And it's only one paper, and there are other papers that say opposite things. But people really jumped on this and said, yes, this is because of AI. And there are various explanations. One is exactly as you say. Why would you hire if someone spent their whole university career just asking
yeah,
ChatGPT for the
yeah,
answers? Why would you hire them? You could just ask ChatGPT yourself. So that would be kind of one reason. A
yeah,
more subtle version of that argument is that if you are using AI within a company, you need people with experience who can tell when the AI is wrong.
yeah,
And people who are new graduates do not have that experience. And so you would actually rather hire somebody who's a bit more expensive, but has, 5 or 10 years of experience. And then when you put them in front of the AI, they can say, oh, well, it's right about this and it's wrong about that.
But
And
but
so
that's a
then
catch-22
it
situation, right?
totally is, because this is taking away the bottom rung of the
Yeah.
ladder. So we don't know whether that's true. I think it's probably some truth to it. It's probably
Mm.
multiple factors that have led
Yeah.
to lower hiring of graduates. There's the general economic uncertainty. There's also just generally the fact that companies hired lots of people during the pandemic, probably too many in some cases, and so they've been slowing their hiring since then. And then, yes, I think AI probably is a component of this in some industries, in some fields. It's starting to be quite useful. So
Especially for software programmers.
software coding and customer support are the
Yeah.
areas where it does seem to be useful, right away. In other, I mean, I think the agents still aren't really ready for prime time, but we'll see. But yes, I think
Yeah.
that whether there's a boom or a bust, we are going to see more concern about AI and jobs. Because if there's a boom, people will say, "Oh no, it's all these AI companies. Look how well they're doing. They're making all this money. They're taking my job."
Yeah.
And then if there's a bust, people will say, "Well, companies are going to be looking for ways to cut costs now, and one of the things they're going to do is say, where can we get rid of people and use AI instead?" And maybe it
Yeah.
won't be quite as good at its job, but it will never go on holiday and it will never go to sleep. And we should look for
Is it
efficiencies.
Yeah. Is it a concern for you that US and China all entering into this kind of a two-speed economy, whereas AI is still continue to boom and productivity is growing, but the real economy, in China, the real economy is not doing, consumption is not growing as expected. In the States, we have the affordability crisis where average people feel like, I'm not getting, the inflation is getting ahead of me.
Yeah.
It's making life miserable. How do we deal with that, even though
I
the
think that
economy is
I
resilient? Yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that is a fair criticism, and analogies are often made in America with the Gilded Age, so the
Yeah.
period in the 1890s where you had much wider income inequality, but you also had this very cozy relationship between business leaders and political leaders, and that's
Yeah.
very much what we see now.
Yeah.
And so that was a period, and that led to people got more and more annoyed about that, and it led to a period of great change at the beginning of the 20th century. So we in fact have a historian from Stanford University who writes about this analogy and sort of what it would take to and what it would look like if
Mm.
we had a new progressive era that tried to sort of undo the excesses of the Gilded Age. But yes, I think that is a very valid consumption, that a very valid concern that the AI and, well, just generally, I think that the boom in some parts of the economy is benefiting. I mean, in America, most households don't own shares,
Mm.
but richer households do own shares, and
Yeah.
they're seeing their share portfolios go up in value. And other markets in other parts of the world are actually doing much better than American markets. And so if you are in the top half of the distribution and you own
Yeah.
shares, you are really doing well at the moment. And if you're not, then you're feeling left behind. So I think there is a concern there. And I think AI plays into that too, because, a lot of the stories that are told about AI do involve, science fiction stories where you have
Yeah.
the elites living in orbit and the kind of
Yeah.
everyone else is stuck on the earth and this kind
Mm.
of stuff. So there is a
And
sort of,
also there's a whole idea of solopreneurs that
yeah.
one smart individual could become a billionaire because he's capable and because AI tools would enable them,
Well, I
whereas
think that
the
would
large
be,
majority, yeah,
I think if that happened, that would actually be pushing us in the other direction, because I mean, there are scenarios where AI can reduce inequality. Because if you look at the studies of the call center workers and the programmers, it's actually the best programmers and the best call center workers don't get really any benefit from an AI assistant.
mm,
But the
yeah,
the less the people with less skills, they benefit disproportionately. So it kind
mm,
of squashes the distribution, and the people in the middle of the distribution get a bit closer to the people at the top of the distribution. So
mm,
that's actually reducing inequality. And similarly, if it's possible to set up a company on your own, just
yeah,
using AI
yeah.
employees and AI workers and so on, that would be good, because that would make it
More
easier,
opportunities for the
right, for
average, yeah,
people to start companies without having to, employ people and jump through hoops and so on. So potentially, theory, that could give some people the ability to, the opportunity to build new companies and so on that they might not have had otherwise. So it'd be interesting to see. I mean, the idea of the kind of the one person unicorn, we
Yeah.
haven't seen it. We haven't seen it yet, and maybe we never
Yeah.
will. But these are the sorts of unknown questions that we still don't have answers to about AI.
Yeah. 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 Please finish the
Okay,
last
so
three
then the
points.
last 3 points. Well, number 8 is about climate, and I think it's a
Yeah.
mixed picture on climate. The bad news is that we're definitely going to miss the 1.5 degree target of the Paris
Yeah.
Treaty. The good news is that China's emissions have now peaked, certainly at the top,
Yeah.
and China is going to cut its emissions in the next 10 years by 7 to 10%. And we know historically that China always under promises and over delivers on its climate promises. So I think that actually emissions are going to go down by more
Mhm.
than that. So that means we're kind of at the top for global emissions. China is now adding new electrical capacity faster than industrial demand is growing. And it's also exporting its clean tech to the rest of the world. And so we have this clean tech boom underway across the global south in particular. And I think that's actually very good news. So I think by the end of the century, it's a bit of an exaggeration to say China will save the world from climate change, but I think it's basically that's what's going to happen.
Yeah.
So under the radar, that's good news. The thing is that in America, at least, companies do not want to talk about what they're doing about climate change because Donald Trump says it's a hoax. And if you start talking about it, then he might put tariffs on your company or who
Yeah.
knows what he might do. So everyone is just keeping quiet about it. But
But
actually,
continue
I
doing
think
it. Yeah.
they're still doing it. And
Yeah.
then there are
Yeah.
two technologies that I think are really worth watching. One is geothermal technology, which is having a renaissance. It's kind of been reinvented using technology from the fracking
Yeah.
industry. So this horizontal drilling underground, you can make geothermal energy much cheaper and more efficient to build. And so that's very exciting. And it's also using technology from the fossil fuel industry. So you can take all those people who know how to do that drilling, and it's still
Yeah.
drill baby drill, but it's drill baby drill in a
Yeah.
good way. So
Yeah.
that's good. And then the other one is fusion. There's
Yeah.
about 30 startups around the world, quite a lot of them in America, Canada, and China, that are trying to make nuclear fusion work.
How far
And
away are we
well,
from
that's the
reality?
thing.
Yeah.
So there are already companies in America who are selling. They're doing contracts to sell electrical energy from fusion reactors starting in 2028. They haven't even built these reactors yet, but one of them, Helion, has just done a deal with Microsoft. And what's happened is that the big AI tech companies,
Yeah.
they need energy for their data centers, and so they've been throwing money at startups that are trying new kinds of energy technology, including geothermal. So the
Yeah.
breakthrough in geothermal has been funded by Bill Gates and Google and others who have
Yeah.
invested in a startup that is making real progress there. And in fusion, similarly, we've got lots of money coming in from the tech firms. And so even if there's an AI, bust and the bubble bursts, we're going to have this very nice potential side
Mm.
benefit that we may get
Yeah.
new sources of renewable energy. But anyway, on the fusion side, there's another company called Commonwealth Fusion. It's a spin out from MIT, and they are about to switch on their first test reactor. It may be the first reactor in the world that produces more energy than you have to put into it to make it
Yeah.
get started. And if that
Yeah.
works, then we're off to the races. And I think I'm reminded of what happened with AI. The idea of AI has been around since the 1950s, but it really only started working 15 years ago. So it didn't work and didn't work and didn't work, and then suddenly it did.
Until. Yeah.
And the same thing could happen with fusion, and the same thing
Mm.
could also happen with quantum computing. But I think quantum computing is a bit further behind. I would say that's still 5 years away
Yeah.
of having a useful quantum computer. But I feel like we're getting closer to it, and things are
Yeah.
accelerating. But I think fusion,
But
we may get there in the next 1 or 2
yeah.
years. So
Oh,
that's really worth watching.
that's really interesting. Yeah. Do you think because of course people are now saying AI equals electricity, so the next 5 years is going to be a competition of who is going to be able to produce cheap and reliable, abundant
Yes.
electricity, and China is a leader in that
Yeah,
sense.
China is much if the bottleneck is energy, and I think it
Yeah.
is. I mean, it's
Yeah.
sort of chips and it's sort of talent,
Yeah.
but at the
Yeah.
end of the day, it's energy. And China is just in a position. I mean, it's adding new capacity much more easily. And just a centrally. I mean, China. One of the things that I'm interested in seeing in the next 5 year plan
Yeah.
is there are things about China's electricity grid, as I understand it, that do need to be fixed. So the sending power from one part of the country to another is
Yeah,
still
from
too
east to the
difficult.
west. Yeah,
Right,
yeah,
and as I understand it, it's all kind of run as separate, like separate countries within China, and they're not connected to get to each other the way they could be. But I mean, the main thing is that China is adding new capacity at an extraordinary rate. I mean, I think the amount of capacity that was added this year in renewables is equal to the entire electrical output of Germany.
yeah,
So I mean, that's a Germany every year. I mean, that's quite serious. Yes, I think that does give China a big advantage. And of course, we see China is catching up on the chips as well. That's going to take a few more years, but there's definitely progress there. But most importantly, I think the constraints that have been imposed on Chinese companies by the export controls from America have led to this extraordinary innovation from DeepSeek in particular. I mean, if you just look at the DeepSeek model, they reprogrammed the NVIDIA chips in a way that American companies would never have bothered to try, because the American companies would have just said, "Oh, we'll just buy more chips."
yeah.
And so what DeepSeek did was really, really clever by reprogramming the network layer of the chips to just make it much more efficient. So I think a lot of the
Yeah,
in
ironically,
this.
constraints actually
Exactly.
help
Constraints drive
facilitate,
innovation.
yeah,
Exactly. And we are
innovation.
absolutely seeing that with
Yeah,
Chinese AI.
yeah,
Anyway, so that's on the energy front.
yeah,
I think, it's a mixed picture, but there's quite a lot of good news that I think more people should be told about. And so that's what I'm telling people about.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay, then finally, sport. So I turn to
Sports. Yeah,
sport for number nine. And usually sport is a sort of way of getting away from politics and a way of sort of everyone coming together. And, it can be very uplifting, the Olympics and things like that. But what we're going to have next year is slightly tricky, because we're going to have the Football World Cup in the US. It's being co-hosted by Canada and Mexico. And those three countries are not getting on well right now, as well as the fact that they're kind of arguing about tariffs, and Donald Trump wants to make Canada the 51st state and all this kind of stuff. In addition, they have to renegotiate their trade deal, the USMCA, which comes up for renewal. So there's going to be, drama on the pitch and off the pitch, I think. So that's worth watching. The other tournament that I think is going to hit the headlines in a big way next year is the Enhanced Games in Las Vegas. And this is a sporting tournament where the athletes are allowed to take drugs. In fact, they're encouraged to take drugs. And if they break any world records using drugs, then they get special prizes. So this is already leading to a lot of debate about the ethics of taking drugs and the safety of it. I mean, the organizers say this is much safer than what normally happens, which is that people are taking drugs, but they're hiding it and it's not safe.
yeah,
In this tournament, everyone is going to be completely open about which drugs they're taking, and they're going to be monitored very closely. And so apparently that's going to make it much safer. We'll see. But there's a lot of
yeah.
debate about the ethics of this. And basically, is sport that's done with the help of drugs cheating, or is it just a different category of sport? When you have people on bikes or in cars, we know they can go faster than people who are just on foot, and we don't think that's cheating. We say that's just a different sport. So is that true when you're using drugs to go faster? We'll see. And then the
Yeah.
final piece, the number 10, is also about drugs, but a different kind of drug, which is the slimming drugs, Ozempic and Wegovy and Manjaro and so on. And it's going to be a really big year for them in 2026 for several reasons. The first is that there are lots of new versions of these drugs with new names. So we're going to have to learn a whole load of new names that are coming that are much better. That you only have to have an injection once a month instead of once a week. They ensure that you lose weight from your fat, not from your muscle, and so on and so on. So that's very good. But what's also interesting is we're going to have these drugs are coming off patent in many countries. So in China, in India, in Brazil, in Turkey, these drugs are no longer going to be covered by patent. So there are going to be cheaper versions available as generics, and that's going to expand access, which is very good. Another thing that's going to expand access is that these drugs are going to be available in the form of pills for the first time. And that's going to increase access in parts of the world where there isn't reliable refrigeration for injectable drugs. So it really is going to be transformative, and this is going to also increase the debate about these drugs. And are these drugs cheating as well? Should you just
Yeah.
go on a diet?
Yeah.
Is
Why
it?
do you think that the world is so obsessed with these kind of drugs that
Well, I think it's precisely for this reason, which is that
yeah, you don't
there
need to
is a
put
kind
in
of.
the efforts. You just
Well, right, but they
outsource that to a pill.
exactly, but I think it raises these questions because we've argued about whether taking drugs is cheating in
Yeah.
bodybuilding and in
Yeah.
sport for
Yeah.
years. But most people don't have most people aren't athletes. I don't get to take part in the Olympic Games,
Yeah.
but I can take part in the Ozempic Games, right? I can argue with my
Yep.
friends about whether I should take these drugs or whether are they secretly taking them. Isn't that
Yeah.
cheating? All this kind
Yeah.
of stuff. So that's going to be, I think, a big subject of discussion
Yeah.
next year.
Yeah. It
The
will
other
be
thing is
also
that
an
we'll get
interesting discussion about double their standards, right? If you
yeah,
apply to
exactly,
yourself,
exactly.
right?
Exactly. So there's all sorts of things to argue
Yeah.
about there. The other interesting thing about these drugs is that they seem to have very beneficial side effects.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
reduce other kinds of disease, so heart
Yeah.
disease, liver, kidney disease, the onset of
Yeah.
cancer, compulsive
So
behavior,
longevity is
reduces,
another
and
element.
even
Yeah.
exactly, even
Yeah.
longevity. There have been a couple of studies lately on dementia. They don't seem to slow the onset of dementia, but that's like the first time that, people have been disappointed by the because honestly, they keep finding new things that these drugs seem to do. So the implication is we should all be on them all the time. But we'll see. But I think
Yeah.
a lot
Yeah.
more people are going to be on them next year,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and there's going to be a lot of discussion about that. And just in summary, I think the framing, I think, for the whole year is that we have a lot of uncertainty in a lot of areas. So we don't know what's happening in geopolitics, as I said,
Yeah.
and where are we? What kind of view does Donald Trump have? And in particular, I think the big unknown is where Donald Trump stands on China, and
Yeah.
does he want to leave America's allies in Asia to fend for themselves like he has done in Europe,
Mm.
or does he want to strike some kind of deal with China? Would that deal include America changing its position on Taiwan or adopting different language? We don't know. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. There's a lot of uncertainty in trade and what happens with the trade war. There's a lot of uncertainty on what happens in the economy. Will there be a bond market crisis? Will there be
Mm.
a stock market crash? We don't know. And there's a lot of uncertainty around technology and the impact of AI. Is it really taking graduates' jobs? Et cetera, et cetera. So what's interesting about 2026 is that I think we are going to get answers to some of those questions.
Yeah.
We are going to get some clarity, and I think in many ways, what happens next year is going to set the trajectory for the next decade. So
Yeah.
it's going
Yeah.
to be a
Yeah.
really, really interesting year to see where we come out on some of these really big questions.
Yeah, I think that's because this year is the end of the quarter century. A lot of press in China is doing
Oh,
this
right, right.
review.
Oh, the kind of
So
roundup of the
for
quarter
yeah,
century.
yeah.
Yeah.
So for the past 25 years, there's a lot of changes. Can you share with us like two things? One, what surprises you most? And what's something that you've had high hopes but didn't deliver?
Oh, that's a really good question.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I've always been quite keen on, following what's happening in technology.
Yeah.
And generally, I think it's um, I went and studied AI in the 80s when it didn't work, and now it does work. So I suppose I did think that technology would be really transformative. Um, and when I started my career, I was writing about it, but I was trying to write about it in a more sober and realistic way. And I think the big story of the last 25 years is actually the spread of the smartphone
Yeah.
and the kind of personal internet device and the extension of connectivity to nearly all of humanity now. And I think that's a bigger deal. Going from having no connectivity, nothing at all, to having
Mm.
the internet in your hand is a much bigger
Yeah.
deal than like going from a telephone to a fax machine to that's all very gradual. So a
Yeah.
lot of the world has gone from nothing to like internet in your hand, which is
Yeah.
a massive, and we've seen the repercussions of that in politics and in business and so on.
Yeah.
But if I was again, if I was an alien on the moon, that would be what's the big thing that happened in the last 25 years? It's
Yeah.
basically it's that and technology, and then in geopolitics, clearly it's the rise of China, and that has been so far. It has been people talk about the Thucydides trap
Mm.
that whenever
Yeah.
there's a new rising power, it inevitably leads to a war. And does
Yeah.
that mean there has to be a war between China and the West or China and America? And so far that hasn't happened. But I think so far the rise of China has been beneficial in many ways because of the clean tech. Those
Mm.
phones. I mean, the reason we all have these really good phones is because
Yeah.
of supply
Because
chains in China.
the likes of
And
Xiaomi.
exactly, exactly. Well, I'm also think. I mean, my iPhone is assembled in China. The reason that you can have, when I remember going and reporting on the spread of phones in sub-Saharan Africa, 15 years ago, and everyone had these Chinese
Yeah.
$20 phones, right?
Yeah.
The European manufacturers were making Nokia was making $200 phones, and there were lots of just Chinese brands that were like have a phone for $25. So that really did expand access, and uh, yeah. So I think the expansion of, and then Huawei, of course, on the back
Yeah.
end was very responsible for bringing down
Yeah.
the prices of network gear, and so yeah, I look at the kind of last 25 years as that extension of connectivity and access, and that means that when you have a new thing like an AI chatbot, you
Yeah.
can get that AI chatbot into people's pockets really
Yeah.
quickly.
Yeah.
Billions of people can use it. I think the more difficult thing that we are now realizing is that at the moment the benefits of AI are going to individual people. They are not, AI is not being adopted by companies, it's really being adopted by people. And if you
Mm.
really want to transform the economy, you have to change the way companies operate. And at the
Yeah.
moment, people are sitting at their desks and they're asking ChatGPT to, or
Yeah.
whoever to do things for them. It's not part of the process, the business process. And I think that's going to take a long time to change, and that's why I think the impact of AI on the broader economy is going to take longer than people expect.
Yeah. Final two questions. One, uh, it seems as if the world is re-evaluating China. China, as told last year, would be a manufacturing powerhouse. It will be someone who's dumping globally. But now it seems as if, especially after DeepSeek, people are intrigued about Chinese ecosystem that China could innovate. But if I want to evaluate China, is China still going to be the one who is actually making things from 1 to 100, meaning that making applications better, smarter, more applicable to consumers' needs, or you would envision a China that could start 0 from 1, really true innovations coming out of China?
Oh, I think China has been underestimated in the West as an innovator for a very long time, and I saw this with when I was writing about telecoms 15 years ago and Huawei. Huawei's equipment, Huawei had a reputation in the West for copying Western designs,
Yeah.
and there were instances of that in its early history. But as a result of that, the stereotype just became, oh well, Chinese companies all they ever do is copy things, and that stopped being true quite a long time ago. People said the same about Japanese companies, in the
Mm.
last century,
Yeah.
and in fact, the same happened with America. So America copied a lot of technology and stole a lot of intellectual property from Europe during the 19th century.
Yeah.
There are cases of Broadway shows, of West End shows that where all the music and all the lyrics are pirated, and the show
Mm.
opens on Broadway before it opens in London. But large amounts of industrial
Yeah.
technology were basically taken from Europe to America. So this is we've seen this movie before. But then what happens is those countries figure out how to do their own innovation. And if you look, going back to the GLP-1 drugs, there's some amazing stuff coming out of Chinese biotech companies, and Western drug companies are now licensing those drugs
Mm.
from the Chinese biotech companies. And we had a cover of The Economist recently about how China again is being underestimated in autonomous vehicles and self-driving cars. We know that the Chinese EVs are the best now, but a lot of people still haven't woken up to this, and you still see this in America. That in particular, I think American bosses still seem to have the kind of very outdated view that China can't innovate and all it does is copy, and that therefore America is fine. And this isn't just wrong; it's extremely complacent. And I think the American car companies in particular are in big trouble.
Yeah.
But anyway, that's I think attitudes to China are changing. People are realizing it is a much more innovative
Yeah.
place, and there's a lot of real innovation. It's just things like
Yeah.
TikTok and DeepSeek. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
DeepSeek was very helpful, I think,
Yeah.
because I think people in AI, people talk about the AlphaGo as a Sputnik moment for Chinese AI, and the Chinese
Yeah.
government saying, "Oh my God, we need to get going." Well, DeepSeek is the same thing in reverse for the West, because people in the West who didn't understand, who didn't realize that actually Chinese AI research is very good, well, they couldn't avoid that with DeepSeek when they saw what it could do and how cheaply it was trained. That was a sort of very, very clear signal that they need to be taking this more seriously. So yes, I think people are starting to adjust their views, but mainly the problem here is that a lot of people in the West have rather outdated stereotypes about Chinese innovation.
Yeah, but how can we make China cooler? Because I think China now aims to be a leader in science, technology, in expanding its footprint. Going overseas is one of the key business trends in China starting from
Yeah.
last year. Because, of course, the domestic consumption is not picking up, so Chinese firms need to go global, but they need to change the perception, or they also need to be cooler. So, what you would advise? You've already highlighted
Well,
TikTok
actually, we have a
is
piece. We
cool.
have a
Yeah,
piece in World Ahead
yeah,
about
yeah,
Chinese soft power and how
yeah,
China's soft power is rising because of the popularity of, TikTok, Labubu dolls,
yeah,
and so on. BYD cars are very nice. I see them all over the world. Um, but I think one of the things we point out in that piece is that to some extent Chinese companies are operating with one hand tied behind their backs because they are still expected to obey some quite opaque, hard to understand rules from the government. In particular, if you're making a film, there are certain themes apparently that you're not allowed to use, and you have to
yeah,
ideally root everything in sort of Chinese culture and Chinese stories and Chinese myths and so on. And that probably means that Chinese films have less appeal outside China than they might otherwise. I
yeah,
mean, occasionally there is a big exception, and a film does really well. But I think if China wants to increase its soft power, then the government probably needs to allow the creators of I mean, just look at how effective Hollywood was
yeah,
at sort of marketing America to the world. And in fact, a lot of what we think about sort of in global culture, we don't realize the extent to which, well, certainly in Europe, we don't realize the extent to which we are mainlining American values. We just think
mm,
of it as like, oh, that's just like normal movies. But actually, the kind of American values of self-actualization and sort of everyone can be a success if they try hard enough, and and fair play and all this kind of stuff that you get kind of forced down your throat in American movies. That has been an amazingly powerful marketing tool for America. And I think China is making it difficult for its filmmakers, as far as I can tell. We don't know because none of the rules are written down, right? So
yeah,
it's difficult to say. But there have been some animated movies that have been very popular in the rest of Asia, but have not crossed over to the West. And so what would it take to change that? I don't know. But I think the charge has to come from actually Chinese companies. It's Chinese companies that will make products that the rest of the world wants to
yeah,
buy. They're already doing that, and they can do that in more places. And the government, it's helping them in many cases, sort of financially, but it may be constraining them in other ways. And so I think
yeah,
if China wants to increase its soft power, that's probably the thing that needs to change. But I don't know whether that's, that might
yeah.
just be politically too difficult.
No, I think relax the rules. That should be something
Well,
that
apparently you're not supposed to have
yeah,
like ghosts and things,
yeah,
supernatural.
yeah,
I mean, you
yeah,
couldn't
yeah,
make a
yeah,
horror movie, and
yeah,
I don't know if this is true, but this is what
yeah,
I was trying to get the person who wrote the story about this. I was like, give me the
yeah.
example. What is it you're not allowed to do
It,
in Chinese
it,
films? And it's
it,
like,
it,
well,
it is true. So it's true for the domestic market. But I think at
right.
some stage, China needs to realize that to satisfy the needs of Chinese Gen Zs and even younger generation, just be innovative and give more room for creativity. That should be
Well,
something.
I think the
Yeah,
Chinese Gen Zs are they're in a very interesting place because they are playing the role now that American teenagers played in the 50s and 60s. So
yeah,
what they wanted shaped a whole load of new things, and in America we got like drive-throughs and burger bars and dating
yeah,
culture and all this kind of stuff. This has all been made up by American teenagers after the war. And Chinese consumers are now in the driving seat, right? What
yeah,
young Chinese consumers do today, the rest of the world does tomorrow.
yeah.
And so they really have a lot of control here and a lot of influence over culture in the rest of the world.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Tom. I think it's an hour and you've highlighted the 10 mega trends, but most important thing you've highlighted that 2026 is going to be a deciding year for us to understand the uncertainties and adapt to the uncertainties. And there will be some interesting developments, but it's worth paying attention because the next 10 years is crucial for China, for the world, for technology, and for all of us because AI is going to empowering us, but we don't know to what extent corporates would be able to pick up the technology and how that transformation would play on for the world. But again, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate that. And I really encourage everyone to read Economist World Ahead 2026.
Great, thank you very much, and happy 2026.
Happy 2026. Yeah.